The fall of the billionaire's son. The clock inside Westbridge Academy ticked with a cruel rhythm, its sound echoing faintly in the silent classroom. Outside, the leaves of autumn swirled in a restless dance, pushed by a wind that rattled the tall windows of the grand old school. Inside, however, the air was heavy, as if it carried the weight of 100 unspoken judgments. At the far end of the room, Ethan Cole sat slouched in his chair, his hands gripping a test paper already marked with an ocean of red ink. His jaw tightened as his eyes moved across the bold letters at the top. Fail. It wasn't the first time. In fact, it wasn't even the 10th. Ethan was the son of David Cole, one of the richest men in the state, heir to an empire of hotels, technology investments, and political connections. But in this room, none of that mattered. Here, Ethan was just another student who couldn't keep up, another boy the teachers whispered about in the staff lounge when they thought no one was listening. His classmates smirked when they caught sight of his failing grade, their whispers sharp and cruel. The billionaire's idiot son. Daddy's money can't buy brains. Cole's empire will collapse if he's the one to run it. Ethan tried to drown out the voices, but they echoed in his skull long after the bell rang. He stuffed the paper into his bag with such force that it tore at the edges. His chest burned, but it wasn't only anger. It was shame, a shame so heavy it made every step toward the hallway feel like walking through mud. He was 17 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that might have been handsome if not for the storm constantly brewing behind his gray eyes. Yet all the strength in his body seemed useless in that moment, because no matter how fast he ran on the basketball court, no matter how sharply he dressed in clothes that cost more than some families made in a month, he couldn't run away from the truth staring back at him. He was failing, and everyone knew it. When Ethan pushed through the school's double doors, the world outside greeted him with the scent of wet pavement and freshly cut grass. He tugged at his blazer, loosening the tie that felt like a noose around his neck. His driver waited at the curb in a sleek black town car, but Ethan didn't walk toward it right away. He needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating expectations waiting in the back seat. Instead, he wandered along the side of the building toward the quiet courtyard no one used anymore. The courtyard was cracked and forgotten, its fountain long dry, benches rusted by rain and neglect. That was where he saw him. Marcus Reed moved slowly across the cracked stone tiles, mop in hand, a bucket rolling beside him. His uniform was faded navy, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms scarred from a life no textbook could capture. He hummed softly, a tune no one else recognized. His head bowed in concentration as though cleaning the courtyard was as important as any lesson taught inside the classrooms. He was the janitor, the man most students ignored, except when they made cruel jokes about how low someone had to fall to push a mop for a living. Ethan never paid him much attention before, but now, for some reason, he stopped walking. He leaned against the stone wall, pulling the failed exam from his bag, and without thinking, tore it in half. He tore it again and again, until the pieces fluttered to the ground like dying birds. The frustration that had been boiling all day spilled out in a growl. He kicked the fountain's edge so hard his shoe scraped, and then he muttered under his breath, "I can't do this. I'll never be what they want me to be." Marcus didn't stop mopping. He didn't even look up right away, but his voice, deep and steady, cut through the courtyard like a bell in fog. "You're fighting the wrong battle." Ethan froze. His head snapped toward the janitor, who was still pushing the mop across the stones, as if the boy's outburst was just part of the background noise of the world. For a moment Ethan thought he'd misheard. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice sharp, defensive. Marcus finally lifted his head. His eyes were dark, calm, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much but refused to be broken by it. He repeated the words, slower this time. "I said you're fighting the wrong battle." Ethan scoffed, shoving the shredded exam into his pocket. "And what would you know about my battles? You're just a janitor." The words hung in the air, harsh and arrogant. But Marcus didn't flinch. He leaned on the mop handle, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I'm just a janitor. Or maybe I'm someone who's fought battles you can't even imagine. Either way, I know what I see. And what do you see? Ethan challenged, though his voice cracked at the edges, betraying the storm beneath. Marcus's gaze softened, though his words remained steady. I see a young man swinging fists at shadows, angry at the wrong things. You're losing not because you're weak, but because you don't even know what fight you're in. Ethan opened his mouth to snap back, but the retort died before it reached his tongue. Something about the way Marcus spoke, calm, measured, without judgment, cut deeper than any insult from his teachers or classmates. He wasn't mocking him. He wasn't pitying him. He was simply stating the truth. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't have an answer. The courtyard fell silent, broken only by the squeak of the mop as Marcus returned to his work. Ethan stood there, motionless, his chest tight with questions he didn't want to ask but couldn't ignore. Why did the janitor's words sting more than his father's anger? Why did they feel true? As the sun dipped later, o'er and the chill of evening crept in, Ethan finally pushed off the wall. He stalked back toward the waiting car, his steps uneven, his mind louder than the city traffic that greeted him at the gate. He didn't realize it yet, but a seed had been planted in that forgotten courtyard, a seed that would grow into the lesson that changed his life. The janitor's lesson. The following day began like any other for Ethan Cole, except that his thoughts were not his own. They replayed a single sentence again and again, as if the words were scratched into the walls of his mind. You're fighting the wrong battle. He sat in class staring at the chalkboard, but nothing the teacher wrote made sense. Equations blurred into meaningless symbols, words floated without weight, and all he could see was the face of the janitor with calm, steady eyes that had looked at him as though they saw deeper than even his own father could. Ethan clenched his fist around his pencil until it nearly snapped. Who was Marcus Reed, anyway? Why had those words stuck to his skin like burrs, impossible to shake free? At lunch, Ethan skipped the usual crowd. Normally, he would have eaten with a group of wealthy classmates who only tolerated him because of his last name, laughing at jokes that weren't funny and pretending to enjoy the hollow games of teenage power. Today, however, he avoided them, carrying his tray down a quieter hallway. His steps slowed as he neared the custodial closet near the back wing, and though he told himself he wasn't doing it intentionally, his feet stopped altogether when he heard humming again, the same tune he'd heard yesterday. The door was ajar and a sliver of light spilled across the hall floor. Ethan hesitated, then pushed the door open wider. Inside, the space was cramped, lined with shelves stacked with bottles, brooms, and cleaning cloths. But in the middle of the room sat Marcus on a small wooden chair, a battered book in his hands. Ethan blinked in surprise. It wasn't the Bible, as he had half expected, nor was it a manual about cleaning supplies. It was a thick, frayed copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its cover nearly falling off. The janitor's lips moved silently as he read, his face calm, his eyes alive. "You read that?" Ethan asked before he realized he had spoken aloud. Marcus looked up, unshaken. He closed the book gently, like someone tucking away an old memory, and set it on the shelf beside him. "Every day," he said. "Some men carry swords into battle. I carry words." Ethan smirked faintly, though the curiosity in his voice betrayed him. "What's the point? You're a janitor. No one cares what you read." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze sharp now, like steel under velvet. "That's where you're wrong. A man is not measured by his title or the uniform he wears. He is measured by what he does with his mind and his heart. Knowledge changes everything, son. It's the one thing they can't take away from you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his instinct screaming to mock the man, to put him back in his place. Yet his heart pulled him closer instead. He lowered his tray onto a nearby shelf and crossed his arms. "So, what's that supposed to mean for me? You think reading some old book is going to fix me? I've failed every test they've thrown at me, My dad's ready to ship me off to some military academy just to keep me from ruining the family name. Nothing's going to change that." Marcus studied him, silent for a long moment, as if weighing not just Ethan's words, but the pain laced inside them. Then he said quietly, "Your problem isn't your brain, it's your discipline. You want the secret that changes everything? Here it is. Discipline beats talent. All the money in the world, all the natural gifts. They won't save you if you don't train your mind. A strong mind is built by small daily habits. You don't fail because you're dumb, Ethan. You fail because you give up the moment the mountain looks too high." The words struck like thunder in the boy's chest. He wanted to argue, to claim he did try, that he stayed up nights staring at books and forcing answers. But even as the excuses formed, he knew they weren't true. He had always quit halfway, slamming the book shut in anger, storming off the moment things felt impossible. Marcus had just exposed the truth Ethan had been too afraid to admit. He had been fighting shadows, not battles. "And what if I try and still fail?" Ethan muttered, bitterness creeping into his voice. Marcus smiled faintly. "Then you try again, and again, until the mountain moves. Because the moment you stop climbing, that's the only time you truly lose. Failure is a bruise, not a tattoo. Remember that." Ethan stared at him, something shifting behind his guarded expression. For years, every adult around him, teachers, tutors, even his own father, had looked at him as though he were broken, a disappointment wrapped in fine suits. But Marcus Reed, a man with no wealth, no title, and no reason to care, was looking at him as if he were capable of something more. That strange flicker of belief unsettled him more than any insult ever could. "Meet me here tomorrow after school," Marcus said suddenly, rising to his feet and grabbing a broom. "If you want to learn discipline, I'll show you, but don't waste my time if you're not serious. I don't hand out secrets to boys looking for shortcuts." Ethan almost laughed. The idea of spending his afternoons with the janitor, or of all people, sounded ridiculous. But as he picked up his tray and left the room, he realized his feet felt lighter, his chest less heavy. For the first time in years, someone had given him more. Marcus smiled faintly. "Then you try again, and again, until the mountain moves. Because the moment you stop climbing, that's the only time you truly lose. Failure is a bruise, not a tattoo. Remember that." Ethan stared at him, something shifting behind his guarded expression. For years, every adult around him, teachers, tutors, even his own father, had looked at him as though he were broken, a disappointment wrapped in fine suits. But Marcus Reed, a man with no wealth, no title, and no reason to care, was looking at him as if he were capable of something more. That strange flicker of belief unsettled him more than any insult ever could. "Meet me here tomorrow after school," Marcus said suddenly, rising to his feet and grabbing a broom. "If you want to learn discipline, I'll show you. But don't waste my time if you're not serious. I don't hand out secrets to boys looking for shortcuts." Ethan almost laughed. The idea of spending his afternoons with the janitor, of all people, sounded ridiculous. But as he picked up his tray and left the room, he realized his feet felt lighter, his chest less heavy. For the first time in years, someone had given him more than scorn. They had given him a choice. That night, the Cole mansion glowed like a castle of glass and marble. Chandeliers glittered across vaulted ceilings, the scent of imported lilies drifted through the hallways, and the staff moved silently as shadows in the background. Ethan sat at the long dining table across from his father, who was buried in reports on his tablet. David Cole barely looked up when the steak was served, his words clipped and cold. "Another failed test today?" he asked without preamble, his eyes still fixed on the glowing screen. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yeah." His father sighed sharply, the sound more like an insult than a breath. "Do you understand what's at stake, Ethan? Do you have any idea? The embarrassment you cause this family every time you stumble. The board is already asking questions about your future. Investors want to know if the next generation can be trusted to carry the Cole legacy. And what do I tell them? That my son can't even pass high school algebra?" Ethan's hands clenched around his fork until his knuckles turned white. "Maybe I'm not like you," he said quietly. David finally looked up, his gaze icy, a fortress of pride and anger. Then you'd better learn to be, because this world doesn't forgive weakness, and in this family, failure is not an option. The words sliced Ethan in half. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, and stormed out of the dining room. His father's voice called after him, but he didn't listen. Upstairs, in the privacy of his room, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, chest heaving. His eyes landed on the textbooks piled on his desk, their pages as blank to him as a foreign language. For once, instead of shoving them away, he sat down and stared at them, Marcus's words echoing, "Discipline beats talent." For a long moment, Ethan just sat there in silence. Then, with trembling hands, he opened the first book and began to read. Not because his father demanded it, not because he feared failure, but because for the first time he wanted to try, not for anyone else, but for himself. And in that fragile, quiet decision, something new was born inside him. A spark, small and flickering, but alive. Failure and fire. The first week of Ethan's lessons with Marcus was nothing like what he expected. When he showed up after school, half expecting the janitor to hand him a stack of books or lecture him like a teacher, Marcus instead shoved a broom into his hands and pointed to the long hallway outside the gymnasium. "You want discipline? Start here." Ethan frowned, staring at the broom as though it were an alien object. "You've got to be kidding me. How is sweeping a hallway going to help me pass exams?" Marcus's expression didn't waver. "Because you can't learn to master big battles until you learn to master small ones. Anyone can sit down with a book for 5 minutes. It takes discipline to do the same motion, step after step, with focus, until the job is done right. If you can't finish sweeping a floor without cutting corners, you won't finish anything else in life." Reluctantly, Ethan began to sweep. At first, he dragged the broom half-heartedly across the tiles, leaving clumps of dust and streaks of dirt behind. Marcus walked silently beside him, saying nothing. But when Ethan announced he was done, Marcus simply pointed to the untouched corners and the uneven strokes, his face stern. "Again, do it right this time." By the 4th attempt, Ethan's shoulders ached, his back burned, and sweat dotted his forehead. He wanted to throw the broom across the hall, to storm out and call Marcus insane, but something inside him resisted. The memory of Marcus's steady voice, the thought of his father's scorn, the realization that quitting now would only prove the janitor right. So he kept going, stroke after stroke, until the floor gleamed under the fading light. When he finally leaned on the broom, breathless, Marcus nodded once. "Better. You see, it's not about sweeping floors. It's about teaching your mind that every action matters. The way you do the small things is the way you'll do the big ones." That night, when Ethan dragged himself home, his father barely noticed. David Cole was locked in a conference call with investors, his voice sharp and commanding. Ethan didn't even bother mentioning where he'd been. He knew the answer. His father would sneer at the thought of his son wasting time with a janitor, and so he kept his secret close, like a fragile flame cupped in his hands. Over the next weeks, Marcus introduced Ethan to more exercises. Some were mental, memorizing passages from books, solving puzzles while noise blared from an old radio in the background. Others were physical, running laps around the courtyard, carrying buckets of water up and down the stairs, even holding a plank position until Ethan's arms trembled and sweat dripped onto the tiles. Each time Ethan thought he had reached his limit, Marcus would push him a little further, never with cruelty, but with a steady insistence. One afternoon, exhausted and frustrated after failing yet another math problem, Ethan slammed his pencil onto the desk. "I can't do this. It's impossible," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty hall. Marcus sat across from him, arms folded, his gaze patient but firm. "You think you're the only one who's failed? I failed more times than I can count, Ethan. I've lost battles, lost people, lost everything I thought I needed to survive, but every time I fell, I got back up. That's the difference between a boy who stays broken and a man who learns to fight." Ethan's anger wavered, replaced by something softer, though he tried to hide it. "What if I'm not like you? What if I don't have what it takes?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. "The fire inside you doesn't care about your last name. It doesn't care about money or status or what people expect. It only cares about whether you feed it or let it die. Right now, you're standing at the edge of that fire. You can either step back into the cold, or you can walk through and come out stronger. The words lodged deep in Ethan's chest. He didn't respond right away, but that night, long after Marcus had left, he found himself opening his math book again. This time, he forced himself to work through each problem slowly, refusing to slam the book shut when frustration crept in. Hours later, when his eyelids drooped and the ink blurred, he realized he had solved 2 problems correctly. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next day in class, his teacher scrawled an equation on the board and asked for a volunteer. For once, Ethan's hand twitched upward before he could stop it. The class snickered, expecting the usual embarrassment, but Ethan ignored them. He walked to the front, chalk in hand, and began to write. His chest pounded, his palms sweated, and for a moment he thought his mind would betray him. But as he followed the steps Marcus had drilled into him, breathe, focus, one move at a time, something remarkable happened. The solution appeared clearly, as though the fog had lifted. When he placed the chalk down, the teacher blinked in surprise. The answer was correct. The room fell silent. A few whispers rippled through the back row, but for the first time in years, no one laughed. Ethan returned to his seat, his face carefully blank, but inside his chest a storm of pride and disbelief raged. He had done it. That evening, Marcus found him waiting in the courtyard, his grin barely restrained. "I got one right today," Ethan said, almost breathless. "In front of everyone." Marcus nodded, a faint smile curling his lips. "Good. That's the first spark. But don't let it fool you. The world doesn't change from one victory. It changes from the fire you build with 1,000 small sparks." And yet, as the weeks wore on, the path wasn't smooth. Ethan stumbled again and again. Some nights he stayed up until dawn and still failed tests, his progress erased by exhaustion. Some afternoons he stormed out of Marcus's lessons, furious at himself, furious at the world, shouting that he was done. But Marcus never chased him. He simply kept sweeping, kept reading, kept waiting. And when Ethan returned, sometimes hours later, sometimes days, Marcus always looked at him the same way, with calm patience, as though he had known all along the boy would come back. The breaking point came one gray Thursday afternoon. After weeks of effort, Ethan sat down for another exam, determined to prove his progress. But when the paper was returned, the red ink was there again, cruel and merciless. Another failure, another bruise to his fragile pride. He stormed into the courtyard, crumpling the exam in his fist, his chest heaving. When Marcus saw him, Ethan hurled the paper onto the ground. "What's the point?" he shouted. "I work harder than I ever have, and I still fail. I'm never going to be good enough. Maybe my dad's right. Maybe I'm just—" Marcus's voice cut through like a blade. "Enough!" Ethan froze. Marcus rarely raised his voice, but now it thundered with authority. The janitor stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a fire Ethan had never seen before. "You think one more failure defines you? You think falling down makes you worthless? Let me tell you something, boy. I have failed in ways you can't imagine. I've watched men die because I made the wrong choice. I've lost jobs, lost homes, lost nights of sleep wondering if I was good enough. But I learned the truth the hard way. Failure is not the enemy. It is the teacher. And if you walk away now, then you are the one giving it power." Ethan's throat tightened, his anger melting into raw silence. He had expected scolding, maybe pity, but what he heard instead was fire. Fire that came from wounds, not from superiority. Marcus wasn't preaching from a pedestal. He was pulling Ethan up from the dirt he himself had once lain in. "Do you want to burn?" Marcus demanded, his voice steady now, quieter but sharper. "Do you want to let that fire consume you, or do you want to learn how to use it to light your way?" The courtyard held its breath. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at the man before him. Something inside him shifted, deeper than pride, deeper than anger. For the first time, He saw Marcus not as a janitor, not even as a mentor, but as a man who had already walked through the fire he feared. Ethan bent down, picked up the crumpled exam, and straightened it with trembling hands. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Teach me how to use it." Marcus nodded once, the faintest glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Then tomorrow, we begin again. And this time, you don't quit." The clash with the father. The Cole mansion gleamed that night under the glow of imported chandeliers, but for Ethan the house felt colder than ever. He walked across the marble floors, his shoes echoing in the silence, his body sore from another round of Marcus's relentless training. The lessons had become harder each day, reading until his eyes burned, memorizing passages, running drills until sweat soaked through his shirt. But the strange thing was, Ethan no longer hated it. For the first time in his life, he felt himself slowly changing. The sparks Marcus spoke of were real. They flickered inside him, fragile but alive. Yet as soon as he entered the mansion, the weight of his father's expectations pressed down on him again, suffocating that small flame. David Cole was waiting in his study, a cavernous room lined with polished mahogany shelves and a massive desk carved from black oak. Behind him, the city lights shimmered through the glass wall, a kingdom he ruled with sheer will. He didn't look up when Ethan entered, still reading over reports displayed on a sleek tablet. His voice was clipped, a command rather than a greeting. "Sit." Ethan lowered himself into the leather chair across the desk, his chest tightening. He had faced Marcus's grueling tasks, endured the jeers of classmates, even swallowed failure after failure, but nothing unsettled him like the calm steel in his father's tone. David finally looked up, his gray eyes sharp as knives. "I've been hearing things," he said slowly. "Things about you spending your afternoons with the janitor." He spat the last word as though it were a disease. "Is it true?" Ethan swallowed, his instinct screaming to deny it, but the lessons Marcus drilled into him whispered otherwise. Face the truth. Discipline begins with honesty. He met his father's eyes, steady but nervous. "Yes, his name is Marcus Reed. He's been helping me." David's jaw clenched. "Helping you? Helping you do what? Waste time with a mop and broom? Ethan, do you have any idea how ridiculous this is? While your peers are preparing for internships and advanced courses, you're playing apprentice to a janitor." "He's teaching me discipline," Ethan shot back, his voice rising despite himself. "He's teaching me how to think, how to push through when things get hard. He believes in me." The words slipped out before Ethan could stop them, but once spoken, they burned with truth. For a heartbeat, David's composure faltered, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face, but it vanished quickly, replaced by disdain. "Belief doesn't build empires," David said coldly. "Power does. Results do. Discipline? Discipline is worthless if it doesn't put you ahead. And don't tell me about thinking. If you'd listened to the tutors I've paid for, you wouldn't be failing." Ethan's chest tightened with a surge of anger. For years he had carried his father's disappointment like chains, letting it define him. But Marcus's lessons echoed in his mind. Every battle begins with standing your ground. He leaned forward, his fists pressing against his knees. "Those tutors didn't care about me," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "They wanted a paycheck. They gave up on me the moment I struggled. Marcus didn't. He stayed. He taught me when everyone else said I was a lost cause. You want results? Fine. But I'm not giving him up." The study went silent, the only sound the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. David stared at his son as if he had just spoken in another language. For a long moment, neither moved. Then David set the tablet down with deliberate calm. "You want to prove yourself?" he asked quietly, dangerously. "Then prove it. The Academy Board is holding its entrance exam in 3 months, the same test that decides who gets into the nation's top universities. If you pass, you'll stay. You'll earn my respect. But if you fail, Ethan, I'll cut you off from this nonsense. No more janitors, no more excuses. I'll ship you to Stonehaven Military Academy and they'll break you into the man I couldn't." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The academy exam was infamous, designed to weed out not only the unprepared, but the faint of heart. Students studied for years to survive it, and his father was giving him 3 months. A part of him wanted to shout that it was impossible, but then Marcus's voice rose in his memory. "Failure is a bruise, not a tattoo. The only time you lose is when you stop climbing." Ethan stood slowly, his heart pounding like war drums. "Fine," he said. "I'll take it, and I'll pass. But not for you, for me." David's eyes narrowed, but for the first time, a flicker of respect glimmered beneath the storm. "We'll see." That night, Ethan found Marcus in the courtyard, sweeping as always, the quiet rhythm of the mop against stone grounding him. Without a word, Ethan told him what had happened. Marcus listened, then nodded slowly. "So now you've got a mountain," Marcus said. "Good. Mountains show you who you really are." Ethan let out a shaky laugh. 3 months. That's all I've got." Marcus looked him squarely in the eye. "Then we use every minute. But remember this, Ethan. Win or lose, your worth isn't tied to their judgment. You are not your father's pride. You are it. You're not your classmates' laughter. You are the choices you make when no one is watching. That's what will define you." The boy nodded, the fire inside him both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, the challenge ahead didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like a battlefield, and he was ready to fight. The one secret that changed everything. The morning of the academy exam arrived with the kind of stillness that made the world feel as though it were holding its breath. The city outside the Cole estate hummed with its usual rhythm of traffic and chatter, but inside Ethan's chest there was only thunder. He stood in front of his mirror, staring at the reflection of a boy who no longer felt like the boy he had been months ago. His jaw was sharper, his posture straighter, his eyes steadier. The expensive suit his father had laid out for him felt less like a costume and more like armor. For years he had been a prisoner of expectation, crushed by shame and failure. But today, as he straightened his tie with trembling fingers, he repeated the words Marcus had drilled into him. "Discipline beats talent. One step at a time. Every battle is won in the details." The exam hall at Westbridge Academy was a cathedral of silence. Long rows of desks stretched beneath towering windows, sunlight streaming in like blades of judgment. Teachers and board members lined the edges of the room, clipboards in hand, their eyes sharp and unyielding. Ethan's father was there too, standing at the back with arms crossed, his presence a storm cloud pressing against the boy's spine. Ethan lowered himself into the chair, his palms damp, his heart pounding. The papers were handed out with a rustle that sounded louder than thunder. The first page stared back at him with merciless equations, problems designed to twist the mind into knots. For a moment, fear rose like a wave threatening to drown him. His throat tightened, his chest clenched. He could already hear the laughter of classmates, already feel the disappointment in his father's stare, already imagine the cruel ink of failure scrawled across the page. But then he remembered the broom in his hands, the sweat on his back, the countless hours of failure endured in Marcus's quiet lessons. He remembered the janitor's calm voice saying, "The way you do the small things is the way you'll do the big ones." Ethan closed his eyes, inhaled slowly, exhaled fully. When he opened them again, he took the first problem step by step. One stroke, one number, one detail at a time. It wasn't easy. Every muscle in his body screamed to panic. Every thought tried to scatter, but he forced himself to stay, to climb. By the time he reached the second page, something remarkable began to happen. The fear loosened its grip. The fog in his mind thinned. The answers started to come, not easily, but clearly, as though the path was there all along, waiting for him to stop running and simply walk it. Hours later, the bell rang. Pens dropped, chairs scraped, and a collective breath was released from the hall. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the stack of paper in front of him. He had finished. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but he had finished. For the first time in his life, he had not surrendered halfway. He had fought until the end. The days that followed were agony. The results would decide everything. Whether he stayed at Westbridge, whether he earned his father's respect, whether Marcus's faith in him was justified. Every hour felt like a blade hanging over his head, but Marcus's words kept him steady. You are not defined by their judgment. You are defined by what you did when no one was watching. And Ethan knew he had given everything. That truth in itself was victos. Rye. When the results were posted, students crowded the bulletin board like moths to flame. Shouts of triumph mingled with groans of despair. Ethan pushed through, his heart hammering. He scanned the list once, then again, his eyes widening. His name was there, not at the top, but solidly among those who had passed. His breath caught. A laugh, shaky and unbelieving, escaped his lips. He had done it. The crowd parted slightly as David Cole appeared, his tailored suit gleaming, his expression unreadable. For years, Ethan had feared that gaze, had shrunk beneath it. But today, he stood tall, clutching the truth of his effort in his chest. His father's eyes lingered on the board, then on his son. Slowly, with a heaviness that seemed to cost him more than money ever had, David extended his hand. You proved me wrong, he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual iron, and I have never been so glad to be wrong. Ethan's throat tightened. He shook his father's hand, but in his heart he knew the victory was not for David, not for the academy, not even for the whispers of classmates who now looked at him with stunned respect. It was for himself, and more than that, it was for the man who had stood by him when no one else had. That evening, Ethan returned to the courtyard. Marcus was there, as always, mop in hand, the rhythm of his work unbroken by the world's noise. Ethan held up the paper with his passing score, unable to keep the grin off his face. I did it, he said simply. Marcus looked at the paper, then at Ethan. He smiled, not wide, not boastful, but with a quiet pride that carried more weight than any applause. No, son, he said softly. You did it. You chose the fire. You walked through. Ethan swallowed hard, emotion burning his chest. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, Marcus replied, returning to his mop, by proving that discipline beats talent, by showing them and yourself that you're more than a name. The courtyard fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of failure. It was the silence of transformation, of a boy who had found his fire. As Ethan walked away, the city lights glowing against the horizon, he knew his journey was far from over. There would be more battles, more mountains, more storms. But now he carried the secret with him, etched into his bones, burning in his chest. Discipline beats talent. One choice at a time, one step at a time. And with that secret, he was ready to face the world.